Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining VistaView Solutions Q&A Cafe. Today, we are on our next iteration of our project management series, Order to Cash for Project-Based Services. Master Data is today's Q&A Cafe with your host, Chris Hogan. My name is Catherine, and I'll be facilitating today as per usual. Of course, the session will be recorded, so I'll keep everyone on mute, and we will send out the recording within a couple of days as per usual. If you do have any questions, please, of course, feel free to type them into the questions or chat box window at any time, and Chris will answer them towards the end of this presentation. And then please don't forget to join us for next week's Q&A Cafe. That is on Wednesday, April the 21st, with Laura. That's an introduction to improving CRM productivity and visibility in SAP ByDesign. You can find registration information about that on our resources page on our website, or of course in the email sent out in a few days. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, in today's session, what we're going to be covering is we're going to be taking a look at master data. Where we're really going to start is looking at all the data that's involved in a project. And once we look at all the data, kind of that is involved in a project, then we'll look at kind of what types of data those are. And then what we'll do then is we'll switch over into ByDesign, and we're going to jump, and it'll be more of like an orientation navigation on the project management screen to get an understanding of where all those data elements are on the screen, and how they come into play. So really the objective for today is to get our heads around all these different data elements that are involved in the system that are really foundational data elements before we can even really start working with a project. And then once we start working with a project, where do they live? What we won't be doing today is going through, any specific transactions. In future sessions, we'll be going through in more detail the setup of the project and then going through those transactions. Today, we just want to get our arms around the data, the foundational data. So with that, I'm going to jump into the next slide, and we'll start going through it. So at its core, really, a project is bringing together an organizational unit, so an org unit within your company, where you've got some folks from your company, a project team, that are going to be performing some work, and that work can be reflected either just as kind of one task for the overall project, or it can be broken down into multiple tasks. This project could be just an internal project, or it could be a project that's being delivered for a customer. When we start breaking this down a little bit further and understanding, what elements are behind each of these, the organizational unit actually has a special name on a project. It's called the responsible unit. So that org unit that's going to be responsible for delivering and executing that project, either internally or for the customer, is called the responsible unit, and we'll see where that lives. And that responsible unit is going to derive the profit center for the project. There's also some other ways that profit center can be derived, but that's where it starts. When we break out the project team, on your project team consists of your project manager, as well as internal employees, and then in external resources that the system calls service agents. And those service agents could either be members that are from your external suppliers, third parties, or they could be external to the company that's delivering the project. So the responsible unit could be, one company delivering the project. And if you have another company that might be, have employees that are working cross-company to deliver these projects, you can have a project where those other employees from another company are acting as service agents, assisting the project team to deliver that project. On a project manager, there's actually a special name as well in ByDesign. So you'll see on a project in various places in reports and on the screen, the project manager is referred to as the project responsible, or the person responsible on the main project task, the project header task. And we'll take a look at that when we jump into the system. If you were delivering this project for a customer, there are some other elements on the project that can be specified in terms of more around profit analysis. And it's really from that reporting perspective where those come into play. As I'm going through this, just call your attention to the legend up here, because we're going to start to see some of these other ones pop up there, kind of gray. These blue circles is really kind of conceptual map, and these blue circles are different data elements that you're going to be able to see on the project screen. Now, you won't use all of them. It really depends on the use case, how your projects are being used internally in your company. But the blue ones are the ones that you're going to be able to see on the screen, and we'll see in the demo where those live. And once we get a little further here, you'll see some of the ones that end up living in the background that need to be set up initially before we can even work with some of these ones here that are in blue. Carrying on, we'll look at tasks. So for a very, very simple project, a project can be defined just with a single task, the project header, and could be executed just like that. But it can also be broken down into a work breakdown structure into numerous levels of indentation. On each of those tasks, as they're broken out, there's a couple different aspects that the project provides in terms of tracking the details of that task. Work is really where all of the services that the project team is going to perform gets defined and tracked. Then there's also materials. So if you were consuming materials as part of the delivery of the project, that can be tracked as well against those tasks. And then there's also the ability to track expenses against the tasks and projects, as well as revenues. Exploding this out just a little bit more, we'll see when we get into the system that in each of these areas, there's the ability from a project planning perspective, as we start setting up the project and preparing to start delivering it, we can define planned values. So we'll see that in work. We can define, how many hours we expect to be providing for each of the services under the tasks. Same thing under materials. What's the quantity, over here, what's the quantity that we plan on consuming? And then from an expense and revenues perspective, the ability to plan that as well. So those planned values end up setting up the foundation for being able to later on do comparisons between what your plan, your budget was for your project, and what your actuals are. And this is the last kind of iteration, just this slide, and that's where I was saying in gray, we see some of these other things, the elements showing up in the background. Before I talk about those ones in gray, there was one more blue one that popped up over here. A concept just to be aware of is on your project, there's the project manager, which the system calls, again, project responsible. There is the ability to set up additional members of the project team to act as project substitutes. They act as kind of like a stand-in project manager, able to do approvals on behalf of the manager, edit the project plan on behalf of the project manager. So that's the project substitutes. Touching on some of these other ones in gray here, we won't cover them in great detail, but just giving a bit of an overview. Over here on the left, so the employees that form part of your project team, there's a couple data elements, foundational data elements in the background that will need to be set up in terms of being able to use employees on projects. One is the work schedule. So the work schedule is what tells the system when that employee has, work days and how many hours they have for work days. Where that comes into play is in the project. If you're using project resource planning and resource availability, that's a critical component for the system to be able to calculate and tell you what their availability is to be able to work on projects. Also, employees, when you hire them, will be given a job. And that job is used in conjunction with something called the labor resource. Where that comes into play is once you have employees that start recording actual work in the form of timesheets over here, the system will use and derive labor resource cost rates for those employees, and that forms the basis for labor cost against the project for those services that have been delivered. Over in the organizational assignment unit area, we see a couple of the things that have popped up. So this is really just to reflect that, again, we have the main responsible unit that's delivering the project. Really, that is an org unit that lives within your org structure, that is an org unit within one of your legal entities, your companies. And that responsible unit has an associated profit center and cost center used in the project. Over here, we got the Workday Calendar. So that's an important component for the project to be able to perform its scheduling functions. So we'll see when we get into the system and we look at the tasks and the Gantt chart, that Workday Calendar is what's allowing the project to essentially calculate out what the duration of the project will be based on the tasks and the working days and holidays, taking all of that into account to be able to show you what the schedule of the project will be. And then lastly, over on the right over here, in terms of materials, so if we were consuming materials on projects, in the background, we would have needed to set up the sites where the inventory is stored and broken into logistics areas. And then over here, if we were using planned expenses and planned revenues, there is some setup that's needed to be done in terms of the chart of accounts and account determinations to expose essentially what are those accounts that would be valid for expense planning purposes and revenue planning purposes. So really the purpose of this diagram is just to give you a conceptual view of all the data that's kind of involved in a project. Now, will you work with every one of these? No. It really depends on your use case and how you use projects within your company. For example, you may have projects that are staffed strictly with employees. So in that case, you won't really need to be concerned about service agents and intercompany and suppliers that are working on your projects. And that project may not be for an external customer, it may just be an internal one. So you can see already, depending on your use case, some of these bubbles don't really come into play. And as we go through the subsequent series of the project management series, we'll see different use cases and you'll get a better understanding of how those all come into play and how those function. Now that we have an understanding of kind of each of these kind of data elements, what I wanted to flip to next and show you before we get into the demo and show them in the system is I wanted to highlight, well, what kinds of data are these, right? We hear about master data, transactional data. Well, what are these things? So if we take that same diagram and just apply some colors to it, this should help just give an idea of kind of what type of data this is. The ones in green are ones that would be considered more configuration data or configuration elements. And what we mean by that is when the system is first, when this ByDesign system is first configured, before any real kind of foundational data is put in, there's a number of toggles and switches that need to be set. And in addition to that, different lists of data. So some of those lists of data, for example, customer groups, could have 5 to 10 values of customer groups, product categories. Your organizational structure is going to define your company and your profit centers and cost centers. The Workday Calendar is defined within the configuration. Some of these, may be a little bit debatable on whether or not they're master data or configuration because you can upload them. But if we were to just, from a, kind of really high level, where you'll find these things in the system, the ones in green are going to be more on the business configuration side, whereas the ones in orange are going to be the ones more on the master data, data migration upload side, and the ones that going forward, you'll be working a lot more with and potentially be maintaining a lot more going forward. So the ones in orange, which include both the, the really kind of full orange as well as the shaded orange, would be considered master data, foundational data. I'll talk first to the ones that are more the dark orange. These are the ones that are, from a strict purpose, really are considered master data. So for example, before you can do any transactions, sales types transactions in the system, you need to have either entered or uploaded customers. If we were working with external suppliers, we would have to have entered or uploaded suppliers. And same with employees and the service agents that work with suppliers. If we were selling products, we have to upload those in the form of materials, right? What is that type of product that we're selling? And if we're performing services, what are those types of services that we're performing? The ones that are a little bit more of in a, a lighter orange, these are the ones that are maybe a little bit debatable on whether or not they're really master data or do they fit more in the realm of transactional data. I colored them more from a perspective of master data in terms of from the sense that before you can even start entering in transactions like timesheets, like customer invoices, like supplier invoices against the project, if we think of that project as just kind of like a container that's collecting all that data, collecting all that other transactional data and collecting the costs and revenues, there's a lot of places in the system and in reports where you'll see that it's looking at the project more as like a foundational cost collecting kind of master data type of data. The last thing is the ones in blue. So in blue is, we've talked a couple of times already about actual work that gets recorded against services and tasks in the form of timesheets. For materials, there will be material consumptions against the project, or perhaps if they were not being consumed from inventory through purchase orders against the project. And then expenses down here, if you had expense reports that were being coded against the project, or third-party supplier expenses coded directly to the project would also come through expenses. And then on the revenue side, we've got your end customer invoices out to the customer, as well as credit memos. So there's a lot there that we've covered. Really kind of the main thing to understand and take away from this overview is again, what are all these data elements that are coming into play when we're working with projects, and getting familiar with some terminology about master data versus configuration versus transactional. And then with that understanding, as we go forward in future sessions, hearing more and more and more about these things, hopefully you'll be familiar with now, kind of what they are. And when we jump into the system now and take a look at where they live in a system, at least from the perspective of the project screen, kind of what they are and how they come into play. So with that, what we're going to jump into next is exactly that, and take a look at on a project, kind of where these things all live. So let me just take this and we'll peel it over out of the way. And we see now that we're in SAP ByDesign. So where I'm going to go actually is, I think, to create a brand new project is where you first really start to see some of these kind of data elements come into play. So we're just on the launch pad here on our home work center, and we're going to navigate to project management. You can see that work center over here, and we're going to go to the projects view. And what we'll do is we'll just start creating a new project. Actually, one of the kind of configuration elements that I overlooked is the different types of projects. So we can do some configuration in the system to tell the system what types of projects we are going to be working with. What this starts to tell the system is, well, is the project going to be one that involves a customer? Yes, no. By defining those in the configuration, we'll limit this list and help you set some of that stuff up already. What we're going to be working with, just for the purposes of today, is we're going to go with a customer project with sales order integration, where we will be working with and delivering work for a customer. And just for keeping things quick and simple, I'm going to actually copy a lot of the data from this project from the existing one. And actually, the one I'm going to copy was the same one that we had from the previous video. And again, really, that's more just to save setting up some of those the tasks and such. So what I wanted to get to show you actually is kind of on the next screen where we start defining the project. Here's where you're going to start to see some of these data elements coming in already. So we were talking initially about, well, who's the company that's really going to be responsible for delivering this project? And we can see that down here. So under organizational assignments, you have to define, it's a mandatory field, within your org structure, what is the org unit that's responsible for delivering this project? You may have one, you may have multiple, again, all depending on the way that your company's been structured and the responsibilities of each of those particular units within your company. We can see that this one here, for example, is being provided by consultant Canning East, and that is that org unit belongs to the company named Product Inc. So that's one of the first kind of most important pieces of information. We can also see down here customer, right? So we're working with a project that's going to be delivered to an external customer. Here's where we would select what customer that's going to be performed for. Because it's going to be a project that's being delivered for a customer, we also see some of these attributes that we saw on the slide around additional dimensions that we can specify really for a profit analysis. So we can, if it wasn't defined on the customer master data record and defaulted in here, we can go and define which customer group we would want to associate this project with for reporting purposes. Same for product category. And then down here, we can see the sales unit that's going to be credited for the sales from the sales perspective of this project. So we start to see a couple of those key elements, those data elements that we talked about in the slide. And the last one before we continue over here is we see person responsible. So I'm currently logged in as Eddie Smoke, so it's going to default to me. But I very well could be setting this project up. Maybe I'm a project coordinator, project planner, setting it up for my project manager. I could go and navigate here and assign it to the correct project manager. So right from the get-go, setting up this brand new project in this guided activity, this wizard, there's 3 or 4 of those kind of key elements already. Once we get through that kind of initial definition of the project, you'll start to see on the next step here, the team. So here we can see some team members. Again, these are all copied in, right? All this here is copied because I was copying from a previous project. I'm actually just going to skip past this because once we drill into the project, we'll spend a little bit more time talking, but you can see here already, as you're kind of doing the initial setup, there's an opportunity to specify who will be working on the team of the project. And so what I'll do now is I'll just go ahead. This gives you an opportunity to, essentially review everything on your project, make sure that you've got it all set up before you go and create it. As long as you're creating your project initially in an in-planning status, really no harm, we can go ahead and finish. The only time you'd really want to make sure that this stuff is absolutely correct is if we were going to go ahead and right here, if we were going to go ahead and jump straight to releasing the project from this wizard, there's a couple key fields on here that after you release it, you can't change them. So a couple of those fields are the customer and billable and responsible unit. Those are 3 key data elements that you better make sure you got right before you release the project. Otherwise, you'll end up having to cancel that project and create a new one. So we're just going to go ahead and finish this project. And on this last screen, it'll tell us that it's gone ahead and created it. And then we have an option here that we can go and continue editing it, create another project. So we're going to actually just jump right into it. And here's where we're going to spend now the rest of our time talking about the where all these data elements live within the project screen. So let's first start with, again, we created this project. Let's spend some time just looking at the project header and some of those key data elements on the project header. So when I say project header, what I'm referring to is the first row in the table down here on the project plan Gantt chart. The first row represents the overall project itself. Everything under that is going to represent tasks. So if we first take a look at the project header here, where I'm going to see details about that project header, there's actually a couple different places that we can see it. Where we're going to see those details is down below here. Now, unfortunately, just it is sometimes a nuisance that with so much data on the screen, you spend some time scrolling back and forth, but you get used to working with it. You can drag this up and it's a little bit easier to see. I'm going to do that so that we can get a better view of what we're looking at here. So when we're looking at the project header, where I want to first go is, when we're setting up that initial project, we had to define the responsible unit, we had to define the customer. Well, where does that stuff all live? Over here on the accounting tab, which you'll only see on the project, which you really only see mainly on the project header, there are some attributes, some accounting attributes on tasks, but the main information around who is the responsible unit that's delivering this project, what company they belong to, what customer it's going to be for, that's where you're going to find this stuff living, as well as the profit analysis. So those, those 3, 4 kind of key initial pieces that had to be set up, you'll find those defined on the project header. If you happen to get it, wrong when you were first setting it up during that wizard, because our project is still in an in-plotting status, We have all the opportunity here to go and change anything that we need to before we release it. Only once we release it, then there's a couple kind of key elements that get locked into the project. So this is where you'll find those organizational assignments, the responsible unit, company, profit center. I forgot to mention profit center. Those are derived, again, right, from the responsible unit, and then customer and profit analysis. So that kind of takes care of the organizational assignment pieces. I talked about the Workday Calendar. So the Workday Calendar is really important from a whole project perspective. And where you'll find that is on the project header under scheduling, is where you define what calendar you want to use to really drive the scheduling for this project. So is it going to be based on Canadian holidays? Is it going to be based on US holidays? Or should it just be based on 7 days working and no holidays? And so what that does is once you set that, that really drives and governs how the start dates and end dates and durations of all those tasks get reflected into the Gantt chart. And when you release the project and schedule it, it'll essentially stretch out the project to work in accordance with whatever those work days are. And if there was holidays and such like that, make sure that it was taking into account that the duration would take a little bit longer if there was holidays within the task duration. Okay, so that kind of takes care of I guess some of the main kind of things on the project header. Let's just take a quick look in here. When we're looking at the project header itself, we'll talk a little bit. We'll spend some time on tasks. So we'll end up spending a bit talking about this from tasks. What you're going to see really between tasks and the project header is very similar across all of these tabs, except here where I mentioned on accounting, you kind of have those overarching pieces on the project header here that will really be unique to the project header itself. But the reason that you see all these other aspects, data elements on the project header is, like we mentioned, remember, you could run a really simple project. You don't need any of this work breakdown structure. If all you really need to do is have a project code, you might just have that and code customer invoices and supplier invoices to it. Or if you just want to run the project header and not bother with all the detail, but you still wanted to plan people doing work, maybe materials being consumed, maybe expenses, you can do all of that just against the project header. So it really just depends on how detailed you need to get. Okay, so let's now pause on talking about the project header. We're going to go over and talk now about project team. So where you find the project team is over here under team and staffing. And there's a couple of different views, but the main one that we're going to spend our time talking about is right here, the team. These other two views are more just viewing how these people that you have staffed on the project, kind of what they're working on, different ways to look at it. But we're going to talk here about team. So here is where you are able to assign people to your project. You're not assigning what tasks they're working on yet, but you're really just saying that they are going to be part of the project team that's delivering this project. Here we can see, remember, this project was, it's going to be delivered by the company Products Inc. Well, here we can see that there's 4 team members, right? And they all belong to that project, or sorry, that same company. So there's no external parties, as it stands, that are working as part of this project. Now, one thing that you don't really see here, who the project manager is. So what I'm going to do is actually, should have just mentioned this while we were on the project header. Over on the project header task, you'll also find a unique field here, which is the person responsible. And so Eddie Smoke here, defined on the project header, is who the project manager is for this project. So back over here. So we've got everybody, these are all internal employees. Well, what if we're going to be working with some external parties on this project? How do we get them staffed on the project? That's no problem. Really, the system sees, as long as they're set up, right, your suppliers are set up and the service agents of those suppliers are set up, or you have other companies and there's employees in those companies, the system sees all of these people as just other resources that can be added. So as long as they've been defined, they can be added. So for example, if I was going to go and add a team member and I just happen to know, that I need to be working with Joe Johnson, so I can start typing in Joe Johnson. And when I select Joe Johnson, we'll see here that Joe Johnson belongs to an external supplier company by the name of Excellent Consulting. If I drill into Excellent Consulting here, we'll just take a quick look just to confirm that. And so here we can see there's a supplier overview for Excellent Consulting. And I'll just close and we'll just get a quick view of Joe Johnson. So when I drill into Joe Johnson, we'll see here that Joe Johnson is an employee. And sorry, actually, I guess not able to quickly get to what I wanted to get to there. What I wanted to show you was the relationship between Joe Johnson and the supplier. So when we look at the supplier record and the contacts that are part of that supplier, we can see as service agents. So Joe Johnson here is indeed one of the service agents, one of the external resources that we can work with on our projects that belong to this external supplier, Excellent Consulting. We could do the same with David, Jessica, Claire, Charlie. We could add them all to our project as well if we needed to, but in this case, we're just working with Joe Johnson. You could also work with employees from another company. So in this case, we can go ahead and we can add John Anderson. And here we'll see that John Anderson belongs to, I just happen to know that this is another company. You're familiar with your company, so it would be clear to you. But if we drill into here, this is where we can see that this is one of our internal companies. And so when we get back to the project, here you can see how easily it is for you to go ahead and add different team members to your project and remove them if you made mistakes or if they're no longer be working on the project. And they could be internal employees, external suppliers, or they could be intercompany employees. We talked a little bit about substitutes. So we know that Eddie Smoke is the main project manager. If I wanted to designate that in my absence, I could also have Peter Sellers come in, edit the project plan, do some review and approvals of time or expenses. I can indicate that Peter Sellers is going to be acting as a substitute. We'll just talk a little bit more, a couple of other things on the project team here, and really, I'm going to skip over the committed work that gets into the resource planning. We'll spend time on a future session talking about that. I really just want to talk about default service. So you can save yourself a little bit of work. So we can see, for example, here that Peter Sellers has senior consultancy defined. And so, for example, maybe John Anderson is going to be working, and I know that for most of the stuff that most of the services, most of the tasks he's going to be performing are going to be of the service junior consultancy. I can save myself a lot of time when I go and assign these team members to individual tasks. I can save myself from having to additionally enter in, their service by putting in a default service here. So we'll go ahead and save those changes. And so we've talked about project team, we've talked about service agents, suppliers, we see employees. I don't think I'm going to drill in too much further into anything there. You get an understanding now, I think, about how those data elements in terms of the project team, where they live, where they get initially defined in the project. So now let's go, and we're going to spend a lot more time now talking about those tasks. So over on the tasks under the project plan Gantt chart is where you define your work breakdown structure, and where you can also use the Gantt chart here to manipulate the tasks in terms of their start dates, end dates, defined dependencies. We won't spend a lot of time talking about that, but in a future session, we'll look at how you can use that chart to do those kinds of things. In terms of the tasks, there's really kind of three types of tasks on a project. So I'll just go ahead and quickly add one here. And what we can see here is project task type. So if we open that up and, oh, that's unfortunate. That's okay. We'll just stay logged in here and see if we can, yeah, that'll be fine. So we can see here that in the system, there's, not sure why that's duplicated, but really you've got that there's, this is our main project. Other than that, a task could be a milestone, could be a phase, or a task. Really, the system treats essentially all of those different types the same. You can still, code work to a lot of them. There's some nuances around, for example, milestones and how those are used in billing. But really the reason that it would use the different types is more for defining if you were going to be doing, for example, milestone billing, or you did want to structure your work structure in kind of phases. The phases on the reporting side is where you're going to see, I guess, the benefits of phases. But at the end of the day, in the system, a task is a task is a task, and you can code just about any, costs and revenues to them. Okay, so we'll just focus on one of these and then talk through now these other elements of a task. So when we're looking at tasks, we talked about how it's broken down into services, materials, expenses, and revenues. So over here on the work tab is where you define and maybe I'll just pick one here that, so that's okay, we'll just add some. So over here, oh, it's not responding, and maybe that's because of, yeah, maybe that's because we had that little glitch, so that's okay. What we'll do is we'll just quickly refresh the screen, and then we'll pull that project up again. And then a quick little tip, yeah, if you didn't know, so you can navigate into the project here, but this is a great little handy. If you know exactly where you want to go, a great little shortcut to get you into that part of the project without having to do additional clicks. Okay, so here we are again. We'll just get ourselves anchored back on one of these tasks and to the work. There we go. So on this particular task, CRM training, work. So here's where we define what are all the different services that we're going to be providing for delivering this task. Now I say services, really what this is, I mean, this task is going to be running over a period of time. We may have one person that's performing this, we may have 2, 3, multiple. And so each of these rows is what becomes an assignment of one of those people. So for example, we had Joe Johnson. So Joe Johnson here can also be performing work, and I think it just didn't save that default because we had that glitch. But here's, for example, where we're defining that both Tanya and Joe will be doing work. In terms of the type of work they're going to be performing, they're both junior consultants. Very well, I could define, that there could be Tanya is performing senior consultancy work on this project. So we've got the type of work that they're doing that's controlled really by the service, and then who's performing that work. We saw that in defining this work, once we start planning out the project, we can tell the system how much work they're going to be doing. And so that's defined over here in terms of defining the planned work values. And so we'll just save that. You won't see any actual values until after we've released this project and we start executing on it, and then people start entering in timesheets, and that's where you'll start to see actual work coming in and the system calculating remaining work for you. But the work is where you're going to find the definition of the services and who's performing those services. Over here now on the materials is where you can define if you're going to be using materials on your project or not, and how you'll be using them. So we can, for example, do very similar to how we did on the work tab. Here we can go and say, well, we are going to be consuming materials, and we'll just pick anything that's in here. So we've got a couple of different things. We'll just pick this one. So we are going to be using some type of product, some type of material. We can tell the system whether or not we're going to be consuming this from inventory, or if we leave this blank, we'll be purchasing it, and we can tell the system how many of this we'll be needing. So again, this is all just from a planning perspective. You won't even see this, actual quantity until we start consuming it. And really the indicator here is going to be what controls the system in terms of once we want to go and start, consuming the material, we'll use the product screen to do that. And really that's going to govern whether or not we're going to be creating, for example, for this material, whether or not we're going to be creating stock orders internally to consume it, or purchase requests to procure it externally. And then once those, are issued, that's where we'll start to see the actual quantities coming through. So if we go back over here now, we're going to move on to expenses. So still working in planning and preparing our project. If we wanted to set up, these planned values for budgeting purposes, there are going to be expenses that'll be coded into the project in the form of either expense reports or supplier invoices. that aren't going to be, for example, things that are covered by material that's procured externally, or say, third party Joe Johnson supplier invoices related to his time, but any other expenses, over and above that, then we can go in and find those planned expenses here. This is where we saw on the, kind of that concept map. If we were going to be doing this, this is where you, in the background, would have had to define your account determination groups and define which ones are going to be applicable to show up in this list here to pick for your expense groups. Once you've defined that, you can pick what you need. And as you see here, you can set in what those planned expenses are. As we're going through some of this stuff, I'm leaving some fields blank. It's more just to hit the high notes. But things like this, like start date, end date, if I leave that blank from a planning perspective, a budgeting perspective on the project, it's going to assume that really that the $5,000 should be spread out evenly over the duration of the project, so evenly over the 52 days. So if I was running this report, and it's spanning roughly 2 months, it's going to put half of that into the first month, half into the second month. But you have the ability to split that out into a more granular, like very specific to exactly where you want it, either by putting in multiple rows or using the period plans to split it out specifically into, time periods that you want. Moving on to revenues. So again, this is from a planning perspective. You'll only really see this, you will only see this on a project that you're executing for customers and that you'll be performing billing. And again, when we first created the project, we had to pick the project type. There's some stuff in the background that says we are going to be working with a customer, yes, no, and then we'll have to pick the customer and say that it is billable. So when that configuration is done, you'll see the revenue tab, otherwise you wouldn't. So here, if we were wanting to set on the project what our planned revenues are, what we're expecting to earn from this project, we can do that here. And similar to the expenses, but this, here we're looking at revenues. Account determination in the background would have had to be set up, and we would have had to specify which of those revenue accounts specifically should show up here for project planning purposes. So, for example, we can specify that we're expecting 15,000. Same thing with the dates here. You can spread that over if you needed to. And then really that kind of covers, at a high level, in terms of where the data elements live for planning out the services, the materials, the expenses, and the revenues from a planning perspective. I guess in terms of the task and some of these other elements here, there are some important elements to understand. Not so much really kind of master data or foundational data, but in terms of setting up and preparing the project are important. So we'll just touch on them just a little bit here. This is where if you were breaking out your project into a work breakdown structure, here you see, for example, we've got, indented one level. Very well, we could have additional tasks indented, multiple levels with summary tasks. So all that could be easily done. But what we wanted to what I want to talk to you about here is when you want to get more fine-grained control over exactly, specific dates that those should start, or if they should start earlier than later than other tasks that they depend on. That's where you'll do essentially some fine tuning on that task or subtasks within the scheduling tab. All of this, again, will be taking into account that main project header's work calendar, right? So that when you schedule it, even though you've done these fine-grained controls, all of that still works within the overarching context of the project's working calendar. And then dependencies over here is where you would be able to define which tasks are going to start before others or stop. And so that's where you can essentially define the chain of tasks. We don't have that here, but that's where you can define essentially your predecessors and successors and define if there's any lag time, like how soon or how later they should start relative to one another. So, just kind of taking a quick glance over back at my concept map, and maybe I'll just pull that up again, and we'll just take a look at that and see if there's anything that we've missed. But I think largely we've covered really kind of like those main concepts. And so let's just take a quick look back over here. So, when we created the project initially, we saw those initial screens on the wizard where it was asking us about the responsible unit. And it also asked us whether or not we're going to be working with a customer. So we started to see the customer. We had the opportunity to fill in some of this data here initially. It also gave us the opportunity to fill in a little bit of a project team. We had to tell it who the project manager was. Once we actually created a project and we came into the project screen and we're on the project screen itself, that's where we can continue working to build up the plan of the project so we can flesh out further, right, all the different employees that we'll be working with. If there's going to be external parties, service agents, whether they're going to be from external suppliers or from another company, so we can define that, as well as we saw project substitute. We didn't really jump into employees, work schedule, and job and labor resources. In a future session where we spend, when we put time entries through, it'll be a lot more clear once we see those time entries come through, for example, for how labor resources are picking up that cost and applying to the project. So we'll look at that in a future session. But then we went and looked at the project tasks, and then we looked at how and where we define these services and the materials and the expenses and revenues from a plan perspective. I'm just realizing, maybe one piece that I didn't touch on is these services and materials and customers. When we're talking over here about master data, so those different pieces that needed to be uploaded, like we did drill into the service agents here, but the services and the materials, I'll just maybe jump back into the system and just cover, one other thing to make sure it's super clear here. So this work here that we're doing on the project, we're doing the work in the form of services. And so when I say master data, each one of these services that my company, I want to break these down into different services, different skills and abilities, either that I want to track, the costing by or the billing by, is where I'll break these out into multiple different codes. And those service codes are what get loaded into the system. This is a real foundational master data piece called the service master data that would need to be loaded into the system. So here, this is the one that represents senior consultancy, and it's by the hour. And so when we talk about the master data over here, this is the service that really needs to be loaded. How that service is used is on the work tab here to define the service that'll be worked. And then same way for materials, like on the project, it's got a tab for materials where we can define the materials we're going to consume. But really the underlying master data that needs to be loaded in the system is called material. Actually, depending on kind of which screen you're looking at, sometimes it's called product, sometimes it's called material. But over here, this underlying material master data record, and we saw, companies working with multiple different types of products. So here we've got a different one, right? So all these unique identifiers for products, those are the underlying master data records that we need to get loaded that represent that type of product. So I think, yeah, just seeing that, that's one thing that I should just have clarified. So I think with that, we accomplished our goal of, again, looking over all the different data elements in terms of how they all come together as part of the project, and then kind of what areas they kind of live in. And we spent time really on the project screen looking at where those specifically master data elements and some of the configuration elements that have been defined, where you'll find them. So with that, Catherine, I think we'll end it there, and I'll turn it back over to you and take some questions.
Great, thanks, Chris. We do have quite a few questions here. So just in the spirit of making sure that we're within our time limit, if we do have any questions that are unanswered at the end of it, I will make sure that we take them down and send them to Chris so he can answer them maybe on a one-on-one basis. All right, so with that, Alex, I will probably save yours till last. So we have a question here. First and foremost, why is product not categorized as a master data of its own?
Yeah, I guess maybe that question came up, near the beginning, and that was kind of what I was touching on just at the end here is, when we look at the project screen itself, right, it's got a tab called materials, but it's really when we drill down into the underlying material record, which the system, depending again which screens you're looking at, it calls materials and products the same thing, but depending which screen you're looking at. So really, products, materials are master data. They are. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, this was towards the beginning as well. I observed no column was created for dependencies among the tasks. Is this necessary?
Yeah, great question. So, the answer to many things is it depends, right? So when we go back and look at the project, it really depends on how simple or complex your project is, or how simple or complex you want to make it, or how simple or complex you want to run it. So if you're running a really short project, maybe it's a week, 2 weeks, 30 days, and there's not a lot of complexity, not a lot of interdependencies between the tasks, then no, you don't have to define dependencies. So for example here, and it's a little bit tricky to see, but if I were to just kind of stretch this out, you can see each one of these tasks, right? They're running from the very beginning to the very end of the project. But if I needed more, finer grain control and wanted to define those dependencies, then you can, but it's not required.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. And I've got a couple more here. Where will all of the requirements be documented or stored? And then how will traceability be carried out across the different levels of requirements?
So in terms, I think what that question is getting at is, here we're defining the project plan, like the what needs to be done, but in terms of like maybe requirements documents or maybe sign-off documents, right? The artifacts of the project, I think that's what we're getting at here. So ByDesign provides you the ability to attach anything that you want to, I guess, the kind of two things we could touch on. So ByDesign provides the ability to attach attachments to any one of the tasks that you want. So, start there. Those sign-off documents, those artifacts, you can certainly go and attach them here. The finished file. And once you've attached any attachments in, where you'll also see kind of like a nice kind of overview. I think over here in the project overview, this is the one that'll give you kind of the at a glance of all the attachments on the project and where they originated from, like which tasks they're linked to. So that's where you can attach documents. Now, what this is not like, if it was, it's not something like SharePoint, right? Where there's kind of like versioning and we can go and collaborate and change the documents and it's always gonna be the latest and greatest. This really is that, you've got a file in that state, you're going to attach it. That's the state that file is going to live in on that task until such time as you delete it or replace it. So you can kind of see that right here, right? In terms of, I guess, behind these tasks, like, so for example, accounting training, well, there might be like 10 things that need to be done as part of accounting training. So where would you break down that other additional detail, those other requirements? Well, it really depends, again, on how much control you need and how much detail you need to capture. Like if you needed to capture hours individually against kind of each of those components, then that might really, set you up that you should be breaking those down into tasks. But if you don't need to really record time to that detail, product consumption to that detail, and it's sufficient to record at this level, but maybe you want to have, some additional, like an outline of things that need to be part and parcel of that task, checklists would be an option that you could use that the system provides out of the can. Now, that's about the extent that ByDesign goes to, really, in terms of helping with, I guess, those additional details around the execution level of the project. It's not going to be as close to, some specialized solutions that are really meant for, the collaboration on project artifacts and things like that. But that's what the system provides out of the can for that type of stuff. So I think that, I apologize, I think that addresses the question, but if not, then you can send something to us and we can schedule something to chat through that further.
Absolutely. And so the asker of those questions just said, thanks, Chris, for your responses. I see we have 5 minutes, so if we can have one more here. So I'll start from the top here. Chris, I saw that your initial team of 4 started on the project wizard, but I wasn't clear if you manually entered them then, or did they appear automatically by default based on some other data?
Yeah, great question. So they appeared based on other data, and I really just did that as a shortcut, so you guys didn't have to watch me create tasks and assign people. So when you're creating a new project, what I had done is I went and said I wanted to create a project of particular type, and it was really this option right here that was driving that. So what I did is I selected existing project. Had I selected none, I'm basically creating a project from scratch. All I would get in this case is just a project header, and then I need to go and do all the work to manually add all the tasks and assign all the people. So it's because I had picked existing project and copied it from another project that was already defined in the system. And there's a couple other options you can see here in terms of how you can kind of speed up the creation of a project, either by using a template but defined by design. It's got like your task structure, or uploading a Microsoft project plan. But that was how we got that there. It was just copying from another project.
Perfect. And then just a couple more. So this was, I think, closer to the middle of the presentation. When you added Joe Johnson, he's a contact of Excellent Consulting. Can he now enter time to the project, or does he need to be created as a service agent?
Great question. So Joe Johnson, right? Yeah, so let's go back and take a look. So Joe Johnson was just so everybody, and again, really great shortcut here. So we want to jump right into team and staffing. So we'll go here. So Joe Johnson, right here. Yeah, Excellent Consulting. Yeah. So here, as a project manager, Eddie Smoke, I've staffed Joe to the project. That doesn't mean that Joe can go and code time to the project. There's a number of different other things that need to be done. So first and foremost is that we still have this project in planning status, so nothing is going to be seen by anybody in the system except for essentially me, the project manager. Once I go ahead and start and release this, then these people that are staffed, they won't necessarily see anything in the project yet on their timesheets. It's not until we go and actually assign work for those people, and I think we're on the project header. Yeah, so I think over here we had, so once I release it, it's these assignments here that are going to dictate who on their timesheet is going to see these tasks showing up and allow them to record time. There's a lot of control that the system provides in terms of, when those tasks should appear on people's timesheets, when it should drop off, and all of that's really governed by the, start date of the task, the duration of the task, and when it ends. So it looks at that and it kind of coincides it with the person's timesheet. And if that person is assigned to it, then it'll appear on their timesheet. Now, I keep talking about timesheet. Now, this is under the assumption that we actually want Joe to be recording his own time. So if that's true, we want Joe Johnson, an external supplier, to be recording his time. He will, yes, have had to been set up as a service agent as part of that supplier. But additionally, we would need to also make sure that Joe Johnson has been set up with a business user, right? A business user account that he can log into the system with. And then once he's got that, then he'll be able to log in just like any other employee, pull up a timesheet, and then assuming that I've assigned them to those project tasks, then be able to go and start coding time. So we just got a couple minutes here, but just to finish that out, Johnson, yeah, Joe Johnson over here. So if I edit this service agent, so right here I can see, so if Joe did not have a business user account already created, then I would see over here that this button would be enabled, request user. So I know here that Joe Johnson, there's a couple different ways that you can tell, but I know this is a really quick check, but there's already a business user that's been created. I think there's a field down. Oh yeah, perfect, yeah. So right here also tells you that this is the login for Joe Johnson. So he's got a login. he could log into the system, he could open the timesheet, but on his timesheet, he's only going to see the projects and tasks that have been specifically assigned and released for him.
And again, thanks so much to Chris for hosting, and thank you for attending our Q&A Cafe today. Don't forget to join us next week on Wednesday, April the 21st for our next Q&A Cafe, which is an intro to improving CRM productivity and visibility in SAP by Design. Again, we will